Before we start, let me remind you of the channel membership for this channel. If you click the Join button right below the like button, you can join the membership and support the channel for as low as 99 cents per month. In return, you will get a cool Jason Voorhees mask badge next to your name when you comment on any of my videos, and 4 emotes that you can use in live stream and premieres chat. Ed Gein, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and Edmund Kemper. Show this channel some love. Now, back to our video. "33-year-old Dennis Nilsen met the young man in the pub late in 1978 and invited him home to 195 Melrose Avenue in London. They continued to drink and eventually crawled into bed together to sleep. Nilsen woke up at dawn and realized that his new friend was now going to leave. He ran his hand over his bedmate's body, becoming aroused. His heart pounded and he began to sweat. He watched the young man sleep and looked over at the pile of clothing they had both discarded. He spotted his tie, so he got out of bed to retrieve it. I raised myself up and slipped it on under his neck," Nilsen wrote 4 years later. "I quickly straddled him and pulled tight for all I was worth. His body came alive immediately. We struggled off the bed onto the floor." Nilsen tightened his grip, not about to let go and lose this battle to the death. His victim pushed himself with his feet, with Nilsen on top of him, along the carpet. When he came up against the wall, he lay there and grew limp, giving up. Nilsen relaxed but realized the man was not yet dead, only unconscious. He ran into the kitchen and filled a plastic bucket full of water in order to drown the man. Nilsen lifted him onto some chairs, draping his head back, and pushed it into the bucket. The man did not struggle, although water splashed all over the carpet. "After a few minutes," Nilsen recalled, "the bubbles stopped coming. I lifted him up and sat him on the armchair. The water was dripping from his short, brown, curly hair." He had just killed a man, and he did not even recall his name. Nilsen sat there shaking, barely cognizant of what he had done and what he now faced as a result. He made himself a cup of coffee and smoked several cigarettes, trying to think about what to do. His black and white dog, Bleep, came in from the garden and sniffed at the corpse on the chair. He ran the dog off and then sat down in shock. He removed the tie from the dead man's neck and just stared at him. Then he got up, put a towel over the window, and hoisted the corpse onto his shoulders to carry it into the bathroom. Gently, Nilsen put him into the tub, ran the water, and washed the man's hair. He was very limp and floppy, Nilsen recalled. He struggled to get him out of the tub and to dry him off. Then he took him back into the other room and put him in the bed. His new friend was not going to leave him now. He ran his hand over the still warm flesh, noticing the slight discoloration of his lips and face. He pulled the bedclothes over him and sat on the bed, trying to think. "It was the beginning of the end of my life as I had known it," Nilsen wrote. "I had started down the avenue of death and possession of a new kind of flatmate." Rather than being appalled at the sight of a corpse, he thought it quite beautiful. He did not really know why he had killed the young man. He just had not wanted him to leave. He had spent Christmas alone and did not want to do the same for New Year's. Now he had someone to spend it with. Later that day, he went to a hardware store to buy an electric knife and a large pot, but he could not bring himself to cut the body up this way. Instead, he opened some new underwear and dressed the body. Then Nilsen took a bath. That's when he decided to try to have sex with the corpse. He got into bed, but could not sustain the arousal he had felt a few moments earlier, so he pulled the body off the bed and laid it on the floor. He used a curtain to cover it. He got into the bed and fell asleep. Later, he got up, made dinner, and watched television with the body still lying there on the floor, not far away. Finally, he knew he needed to do something. He pried loose some floorboards and tried to shove the body into the space, but rigor mortis had set in, preventing him from maneuvering the corpse. He stood the body against the wall, deciding to wait until the stiffness passed. However, the next day, he was still standing there against the wall, so Nilsen laid him down and worked on his limbs to loosen them. Finally, he was able to get him into the grave under the floor. He covered the corpse with boards. After a week, Nilsen grew curious, so he lifted the carpet and opened up the floor once again. The corpse was dirty, so Nilsen carried it back into the bathroom to wash it. Then Nilsen washed in the same water. Rather than stuff him beneath the floor again, he trussed him up by the ankles. Eventually, it went back under the floorboards. It remained there for 7.5 months until Nilsen took it out and burned the remains in a bonfire. He added rubber to the fire to mask the smell of burning flesh. He raked the ashes into the ground. The young man was never identified. Nilsen was astonished that he was able to get away with this and believed it would never happen again. He was wrong. It would happen 14 more times. In October 1979, nearly a year after the first murder, a young Chinese student, Andrew Ho, went home with Nilsen. The young man wanted to try some bondage play. Nilsen was disinclined, but put a tie around his neck and told him he was playing a dangerous game. Ho left and informed the police, but no charges were brought. By 1981, Nilsen had killed 12 men in that apartment. Only 4 were identified: Kenneth Ockenden, Martin Duffy, Billy Sutherland, and Malcolm Barlow. Many of them may have been unemployed or homeless young men looking for a way to make money. Some were homosexual, and a few were male prostitutes. Nilsen claimed he went into a killing trance and on 7 occasions actually freed the men rather than complete the act because he was able to snap out of it. The second victim was Kenneth Ockenden, a Canadian tourist. He met Nilsen at lunch at a pub on December 3rd, 1979. They drank together for several hours, took a tour of London, and ended up in Nilsen's flat. They got along very well, and the more Nilsen enjoyed Ockenden's company, the more desperate he felt at the thought that the Canadian was flying home the following day. He strangled Ockenden with an electrical cord from some headphones, dragged him across the floor, and then sat down to listen to several pieces of music while the body lay there on the floor. Then he removed the clothing and took him into the bathroom to clean him up. Once finished, he placed the corpse in bed and slept with it the rest of the night, caressing it frequently. In the morning, Nilsen stuffed the body in a cupboard, tossed out the clothing, and went to work. During the day, the body rigidified in a doubled-up position. Nilsen took him out a day later and cleaned him up again. Then he dressed the corpse and sat him in a chair, taking photos of it in various positions. When he was finished with that, he took the young man into his bed and positioned it, spread-eagled, on top of him. He spoke to Ockenden as if he could hear. Then he crossed his legs together and had sex between his thighs. Finally, Nilsen relegated Ockenden to the space beneath the floorboards. He took him back out several times so that they could sit together and watch television. "I thought that his body and skin were very beautiful," Nilsen said later. Then he would dress him in something fresh and put him to bed and tell him good night. 5 months went by before it happened again. On May 13th, 1980, Martin Duffy, 16, turned up missing. He was homeless and he accepted Nilsen's invitation to spend the night. After 2 beers, he went to bed. Nilsen climbed on top, trapping his arms under the covers, and strangled him. He went limp but was still alive, so Nilsen carried him into the kitchen and drowned him by pushing his head into a sink full of water. Then he took him to the bathroom and got into the tub with him. "I talked to him and mentioned that his body was the youngest looking I'd ever seen," Nilsen mentioned. Nilsen brought him back to bed and kissed him all over, then sat on his stomach and masturbated. Duffy went into the cupboard for 2 full weeks and then was placed under the floorboards. The next one, 27-year-old Billy Sutherland, slept with men for money. Nilsen did not even want to take him home, but he followed Nilsen after they went bar hopping one night. Nilsen barely recalls strangling him and finding a body in his home the next morning. Malcolm Barlow, age 24, was an orphan with mental problems. He was also a pathological liar. Nilsen found Barlow loitering outside his home, complaining of weakness from epilepsy, and he took him home and called an ambulance. When Barlow was released, he came back and sat on Nilsen's doorstep to await his return from work. Nilsen invited him in, and they drank together before Barlow fell into a deep sleep. Nilsen found his presence a nuisance, so he strangled him. The next day, he stuffed Barlow in the cabinet under the kitchen sink. He sat in the flat with a half-dozen other bodies awaiting disposal. Some of them Nilsen had kept in bed with him for sexual purposes for as long as a week. Having control over these men thrilled him, and the mystery of a dead body that would not respond fascinated him. It was his feeling that he appreciated them more deeply than they had ever been appreciated before. Nilsen sprayed his rooms twice a day to be rid of flies that were hatched. Another tenant mentioned the pervasive odor, but Nilsen assured her it was the decay of the building. Once he contemplated suicide, but his dog came in, wagging her tail, and he decided against it. Instead, he spat on his image in the mirror. To get rid of the corpses, he would put his dog and cat in the garden, strip down to his underwear, and cut them up on the stone kitchen floor with a kitchen knife. Sometimes he would boil the flesh off the head in the pot he had bought for the first victim. He had learned how to butcher, so he knew how best to cut up a body, and he placed the organs in a plastic bag. Then he would replace the whole package under the floor until the next step. At one point, there were 2 entire bodies beneath the boards and 1 dismembered. He also put pieces into the garden shed or down a hole near a bush outside. Internal organs he put into a gap between the double fencing in his yard. A few severed torsos he stuffed into suitcases. When he could, he dragged the bags and suitcases out to the yard and burned the bodies a few feet from the garden fence. It always amazed him that no one queried him about his activities or tried to stop him. In fact, when his apartment was vandalized, he had detectives investigate, and they remained completely unaware that they stood over the remains of 2 men. Children came from the neighborhood to watch the blazing fire that burned all day, and Nilsen warned them to keep some distance from it. As the fire burned down, he spotted a skull in the center and crushed it into ash. Then he raked the remains of 6 men into the earth. 5 more were still to die in that apartment, their remains consumed in a 3rd bonfire. When he prepared to move to a new place, he checked around and nearly forgot that he had placed the hands and arms of Martin Barlow near a bush. He took care of that final detail and then drove away, hoping to put this part of his life behind him. 16 months later, after he was arrested, police officers found over 1,000 bone fragments in his former garden. Nilsen had lost the use of a garden and even of the space underneath floorboards. The house where he moved had been divided into 6 apartments, and his flat at 23 Cranley Gardens was an attic. He was sure this would be a deterrent for his compulsive homicides. However, 3 more murders took place, and his quarters presented a complicated problem regarding disposal. The first victim was John Howlett, whom Nilsen called John the Guardsman. They had met once in a pub and had engaged in a long conversation. Then Nilsen was drinking alone one day when John walked in and recognized him. They chatted and then decided to go to Nilsen's place, where after drinking a while, John got into Nilsen's bed. Nilsen tried to get him to leave, but he refused to go. Nilsen then found a length of loose upholstery strap on an armchair and used it to strangle the man. At one point, he feared he would be overpowered, so he tightened his grip as John fought for control. Then he struck his head and soon went limp. Nilsen kept the strap on him until he was sure he was dead, and then went shakily into the other room. He soon became aware that John was still alive. He lopped the strap around his neck again and held it for 2 or 3 minutes. However, John's heart was still beating, so Nilsen dragged him into the bathroom to drown him, leaving him there for the rest of the night. Then he put the body in a closet as he contemplated how to get rid of it. He decided to dissect it into small pieces and flush it down a toilet. He had to hurry as he had a friend coming to visit. When the flushing process took longer than expected, he boiled some of the flesh in his kitchen, along with the head, hands, and feet. Then the bones were separated and put into the trash. Some larger bones he hurled over the back garden fence into a waste area, and placed others into a bag sprinkled inside with salt, and stored those in a tea chest. He covered that with a red curtain. The second man was Archibald Graham Allen. Nilsen made him an omelette, and what he recalled of this death was rather odd. I noticed he was sitting there, and suddenly he appeared to be asleep or unconscious with a large piece of omelette hanging out of his mouth, Nilsen said. At that point, he thought he strangled him, but does not recall. He thought the man might have choked on the egg dish. If the omelette killed him, I don't know, recalled Nilsen. Since an omelette does not leave red marks on someone's neck, Nilsen supposed that he was the one responsible. He placed Alan into a bath and left him there for 3 days, then dissected him as he had with John the Guardsman. The third and last victim was Stephen Sinclair, age 20, who took drugs and loitered around Leicester Square. On January the 23rd, 1983, some of his acquaintances saw him go off with a strange man. They went to Nilsen's home where Nilsen sat and listened to music, while Sinclair shot up and then fell asleep in a chair. Nilsen went into the kitchen and found some thick string, thinking to himself, "Here we go again." The string was too short, so he attached it to a tie. He draped the ligature over the sleeping man's knees and poured himself a drink. Then he sat and contemplated all the pain in Stephen's life and decided to stop it for him. He went over, made sure he was deeply asleep, and then used the string and tie ligature to strangle him. He struggled slightly and then went unconscious. Nilsen told him, "Nothing can hurt you now." Then he removed bandages on Stephen's arms and discovered that he recently had tried to commit suicide with a razor. Nilsen then bathed him and put him into the bed. He placed 2 mirrors by the bed and removed his clothes so that he could look at the two of them naked together. He experienced a feeling of oneness and thought that this surely was the meaning of life and death. He talked with Stephen as if he were still alive. The dog jumped into bed with them and sniffed at Stephen. Nilsen turned the young man's head toward him and kissed it. He had no idea that this corpse would betray him and finally be the cause of his undoing. Nilsen believes his troubles can be pinpointed to the traumatizing sight of his grandfather's corpse. He was born in Fraserburgh, Scotland on November 23, 1945, the only child of Betty and Olav Nilsen. It was an unhappy marriage, full of conflict from Olav's drunkenness and long absences. The marriage lasted 7 years until Betty divorced Olaf. She and Dennis, along with his 2 siblings, were already living in the home of her parents, since her husband had never provided otherwise, so they just stayed where they were. Young Dennis especially loved his grandfather, Andrew White, but when Dennis was only 6, Andrew died. Without telling Dennis what had happened, his mother took him to see the corpse, which triggered a terrible awareness of devastating loss. He says in retrospect that it caused a sort of emotional death inside him. When he was 8, he nearly drowned in the sea and was rescued by an older boy who was playing on the beach. The boy must have been aroused by Nilsen's prostrate body, for he removed his clothes and apparently masturbated onto him. Nilsen awoke to find a sticky white substance on his stomach. Then his mother remarried 2 years later, and he withdrew and became a loner. She had 4 more children and little time for Dennis. He never exhibited rage, cruelty to animals or other children, or any type of aggressiveness typically associated with conduct-disordered boys who become killers later in life. In fact, he was horrified by the cruelties that he witnessed by others. Once, he helped to search for a man who had turned up missing, and he and a friend found the man's corpse on the banks of a river. The man had wandered out into the night and had drowned. The body reminded Nilsen of his grandfather, whose death and permanent departure he had been unable to comprehend. He felt oddly distant. Having had no sexual encounter as an adolescent, but having experienced attraction to other boys, Nilsen remained fairly innocent. Once he had looked at his brother's sleeping form, exploring his naked anatomy, but that had been quickly aborted. In 1961, he enlisted in the army and became a cook, which is how he learned butchery. He began to rely on alcohol to stave off loneliness, although he kept his distance from others. It was during these years, when he finally got a private room, that he would lay down in front of a mirror in such a way as not to see his head and pretend to be unconscious. The other body aroused him, and he would masturbate as he contemplated it. During the last few months of service, he met a man whom Brian Masters, in the definitive book on Nilsen, called Terry Finch, and they developed a close relationship. Nilsen was clearly in love, and he got the young man, who was not gay, to pretend to be dead while he took home movies. Their parting was a source of great pain for Nilsen. He he destroyed the films he had made and gave the projector to Terry. In 1972, he trained to become a policeman. One of the experiences he recalled was seeing autopsied bodies in a morgue. He found himself fascinated. Nevertheless, this job was not for him, and after a year, he resigned. He got employment as a job interviewer and remained with that until his arrest. He met a young man there, David Painter, who was looking for a job. Nilsen later encountered him in the street, and they went together to Nilsen's flat. Painter crawled into bed and fell asleep. He awoke to find Nilsen taking pictures of him, and he created such a row that he hurt himself and he had to be taken to a hospital. Nilsen was questioned by the police and released. He fell into a life of casual pickups, but was troubled by how transient and superficial they were. He sought something more enduring. He was ready to commit if only someone would commit to him. His fantasies in the mirror developed more bizarre qualities. Now he thought of the other body as being dead, a state he perceived as emotional and physical perfection. He even used makeup to achieve a better effect, including mixing up some fake blood to make it appear that he had been murdered. He imagined someone coming in to take him and bury him. Sometimes it worried him to be so in love with his own dead body. In 1975, he moved into 195 Melrose Place in North London, a ground floor flat with a garden, with a man named David Galligan, who denied that their friendship was homosexual. They bought a puppy, which they named Bleep, and then added a cat. 2 years later, with their diverse personalities causing considerable distress to both, Nilsen ordered Galligan to leave. Afterward, however, he felt very afraid that he would end up alone. "Loneliness is a long, unbearable pain," he wrote. He threw himself into his work, becoming increasingly more political, drank more, and watched a lot of television. The killings began a year and a half after Galligan left. The last body Nilsen dissected, that of Stephen Sinclair, got the same treatment as the two preceding it. He boiled the head, hands, and feet, and placed the rest in plastic bags. He put one part in a cubbyhole in the bathroom, and others went into the tea chest. Some of the flesh and organs were flushed down the toilet. Nilsen may also have dumped some large pieces, because a man found a bag ripped apart near his garden, some distance away from Nilsen's, which contained what looked like a rib cage and a spinal column. He did not report it, and it disappeared within a few days. It was never tied to Nilsen. There were 5 other tenants at 23 Cranley Gardens, but none of them knew Nilsen very well. During the first week of February, one of them noticed that the downstairs toilet was not flushing properly. He tried to clear the blockage with acid, but to no avail. Other toilets seemed to be functioning as poorly, but Nilsen denied that he was having any problems. A plumber arrived to investigate, but his tools did not work. He called in a specialist. Nilsen feared that his own activities might be at the heart of the problems downstairs, so he stuffed the rest of Sinclair's body into plastic bags, along with a partially boiled head. He locked the remains into the closet. He stopped flushing the toilet. 2 days later, in the evening, a company called Dino Rod arrived to examine the blockage. Deciding it was underground, the technician, Michael Catran, went into a manhole by the side of the house. He noticed a peculiar smell. Catran was convinced it was from something dead. He spotted sludge about 8 inches thick on the floor of the sewer and found that it was composed of 30 to 40 pieces of flesh. It had come from the pipe leading from the house. He reported his findings to his superiors. The tenants gathered around him as he phoned, including Nilsen, and he mentioned that they might have to call the police. First, however, his company would do a better analysis by daylight. He then took Nilsen and one of the other tenants back outside with them to see the pile of rotting flesh. Nilsen returned at midnight to remove the particles of flesh and dump them over the fence. He thought about replacing them with pieces of chicken from the store and then pondered suicide. Instead, he sat alone in his flat and drank, surrounded by body parts of 3 men. However, the downstairs tenants had noticed his movements. When Catran returned and found the sewer cleaned out, the tenants told him their suspicions. From deep inside the sewer, he pulled out one piece of foul-smelling meat and called the police. At work on the day of February the 9th, 1983, Nilsen told a co-worker, "If I'm not in tomorrow, I'll either be ill, dead, or in jail." They both laughed. But Nilsen sensed something coming. When he stepped into the dark hallway to go to his flat, he saw 3 men waiting for him. Detective Chief Inspector J told him they had come about his drains. He told Nilsen that human remains blocked them. Nilsen exclaimed in dismay and then asked, "Where did it come from?" They pointed out that it could only have come from his own flat and asked about the rest of the body. Nilsen gave up and said he would come to the station. He knew his rights and admitted that he wanted to talk, and talk he did, as he unburdened himself in sickening detail. The more he talked, the more the police realized that they had been given clues over the past 4 years, and had they acted differently, they might have stopped the killing spree much sooner. A search of Nilsen's closet uncovered several bags of male remains in various stages of decomposition. These were taken to a mortuary for examination. Nilsen told them to look in the tea chest and under a drawer in the bathroom. He also pointed them toward his former apartment, where he had killed 12 to 13 men. He admitted that there were 7 others whom he had tried to kill and had failed. In the police station, Nilsen said, "The victim is the dirty platter after the feast, and the washing up is an ordinary clinical task." Nilsen began to spill out the details of his murders at once, despite being cautioned. His formal questioning began on February the 11th. It lasted over 30 hours, spread throughout the week. Nilsen talked about his techniques and helped the police to identify parts of the victims. He did not really require much prompting. The information flooded out as if to purge his conscience and to get rid of every possible memory. He made no digressions and did not plead for compassion. He also exhibited no remorse. He claimed later that his professional training allowed him to feign calmness so the officials could take down the information. He told them what they would need for conviction, but nothing personal. Privately, he was afraid and deeply disturbed by what he had done. Thanks to Nilsen, it was possible to find the various pieces of bodies and assemble them into a person, as they did with Stephen Sinclair. His lower half was in a bag in the bathroom. From there, they could figure out which torso was his, along with the rest. With a definite identity, they were able to charge Nilsen and hold him pending further investigation. Nilsen also accompanied police to 195 Melrose Avenue and pointed out where he had buried things and made bonfires. A lawyer was now appointed to Nilsen named Ronald T. Moss, who listened with the police to Nilsen's detailed confession. He was satisfied that Nilsen understood what was happening. When one police officer insisted that Nilsen was a predator with malicious intent, Nilsen responded, "I seek company first and hope everything will be all right." Later, he wrote his gruesome memoir for a young writer, Brian Masters, who turned Nilsen's ramblings into a book. As Masters says, Nilsen is the first murderer to present an exhaustive archive measuring his own introspection. His prison journals are therefore a unique document in the history of criminal homicide. After the confession, Nilsen was removed to Brixton Prison to await his trial. He was troubled by the reaction of the press that immediately followed his arrest. "No one wants to believe ever that I am just an ordinary man," he mused, "come to an extraordinary and overwhelming conclusion." Many young men, and even a woman, came home with Nilsen and left unharmed, but a few just barely managed to escape, and some of those had made police reports. A more thorough investigation may have saved some lives. Nilsen claims that he made 7 attempts in which he was either fought off or later changed his mind. He recalls the names of only 4, but 3 of them testified against him at trial. In October 1979, Andrew Ho made a complaint. He said Nilsen had attacked him, but he would not make a written statement or agree to attend court as a witness, so there was no follow-up. Perhaps Ho did not want to admit his own solicitation of Nilsen. Almost a year later, Douglas Stewart said that Nilsen had attacked him. He had fallen asleep in the armchair, waking to find his feet tied and Nilsen putting a tie around his neck. He fought back, knocking Nilsen over, and Nilsen told him to leave. He called the police to 195 Melrose Place on August 11, 1980, around 4 a.m., but they noticed that he had been drinking. They knocked at the door, and Nilsen seemed surprised by what they had said. They figured it to be a homosexual encounter, with both sides hiding some of the truth. They made a report, but Stewart failed to follow up as required. Nilsen lived in his Cranley Gardens flat less than a year and a half, but killed 3 men. He nearly killed several more. On November 23, 1981, Nilsen's 36th birthday, he took a 19-year-old gay student named Paul Nobbs back home with him, and they sat drinking together. Then they went to bed, and Nobbs woke up at 2:30 in the morning with a terrible headache. He woke again at 6 and went into the kitchen. In the mirror there, he saw a deep red mark across his throat. The whites of his eyes were bloodshot, and his face looked bruised. Nilsen commented that he looked awful and advised him to see a doctor. That day, Nobbs visited the University Infirmary and learned that bruises on his throat indicated that someone had tried to strangle him. He declined to report the incident. The victim right after him was John Howlett, who did not escape. For New Year's Eve that year, neighbors of Nilsen were invited to his flat, but they had plans. Besides, he appeared drunk, which disturbed them. They heard him leave the house and return home with someone. Then they heard a commotion upstairs. Someone came running down the steps, sobbing, and ran out the front door. That man was Toshimitsu Ozawa. He told police that he thought Nilsen had intended to kill him. He had approached Ozawa with a tie stretched between his hands. There was no follow-up investigation. In April 1982, Nilsen entertained a drag artist named Carl Stodder, age 21. They drank together and went to bed. He attempted to strangle Stodder, who woke up unable to breathe. He thought Nilsen was trying to help him, but that was not the case. Nilsen carried him into the bathroom and placed him in a tub of water, submerging him several times until Stodder begged for him to stop. Stodder then went under and stopped struggling. Nilsen thought he was dead and carried him to the couch. Bleep jumped up and began to lick Stodder's face, aware that he was still alive. Nilsen then took him to bed and wrapped himself around the young man until he regained consciousness. Nilsen told Stodder that he had gotten his throat caught in the zipper of the sleeping bag that had covered him. Stodder attributed the experience to a bad nightmare, despite getting a checkup and learning that his condition was consistent with severe strangulation. He actually agreed to meet Nilsen again, but did not keep the appointment. He also did not go to the police. While awaiting his trial, Nilsen decided to dispense with his legal aid, Ronald Moss, but then reinstated him. Nearing the trial date, he fired him and hired Ralph Heames, the lawyer of a prisoner with whom he was in love, David Martin. Heames decided to go for diminished responsibility defense, citing a mental abnormality in Nilsen. His defense counsel was Ivan Lawrence, asking for a charge of manslaughter. Nilsen examined the crime scene photos and felt ill over his atrocious acts against others. He wondered if the victims' families could ever forgive him. He wrote over 50 notebooks of his memoirs to assist the prosecution, and also drew a series of sad sketches showing what he had done to some of his victims. On the eve of his trial, he wrote, "I've judged myself more harshly than any court ever could." Nilsen was charged with 6 counts of murder and 2 charges of attempted murder. Alan Green was the prosecutor. He maintained that Nilsen had killed in full awareness of what he was doing and should be found guilty of murder. His principal evidence was from Nilsen's lengthy statement to the police, while the defense relied on psychiatric analysis. The trial began on October 24, 1983. The charges were read and Nilsen pleaded not guilty to each one. Green described the events of the morning of Nilsen's arrest, but did not force the jury to look at photos of the grisly remains. He also mentioned that there was another count of murder and of attempted murder, but these had been determined too late to include in the original indictment. Those who testified against Nilsen were Paul Nobbs, Douglas Stewart, and Carl Stodder. Nilsen attempted to undermine their credibility by helping his lawyer to point out problems with some of their statements. He said that Stewart had stayed for another drink after the alleged attack, which Stewart could not explain, and the defense counsel managed to get him to admit that he had sold his story to the media with embellishments. Nobbs admitted to a sexual encounter with Nilsen and said that he had appeared to be quite friendly throughout the evening. Stodder, shy and quite terrified by the proceedings, also said that Nilsen had been solicitous and friendly. Nevertheless, his chilling account had a damaging effect on the defense. Nilsen's interviews with the police were read verbatim, taking 4 hours. The evidence presented in court included the cooking pot, the cutting board used to dissect one victim, and a set of knives that had belonged to Martin Duffy. The defense witness, Dr. James McKeith, discussed the various aspects of unspecified personality disorder from which he believed Nilsen suffered. He then described how Nilsen had always had trouble expressing his feelings, and he always fled from relationships that had gone wrong. His maladaptive behaviors had been in place since childhood. He had the ability to separate his mental and behavioral functions to an extraordinary degree, which implied diminished responsibility for what he was doing. The psychiatrist also described Nilsen's association between unconscious bodies and sexual arousal. He was also narcissistic and grandiose, with the added hindrance of blackouts from excessive drinking. He had an impaired sense of identity and was able to depersonalize others to the point where he did not feel much about what he was doing to them. On strenuous cross-examination, McKeith was forced to retract his judgment about diminished responsibility in all of the cases. He said that was for the court to decide. The second psychiatrist, Dr. Patrick Galway, diagnosed Nilsen with a borderline false self as if pseudo-normal narcissistic personality disorder. He settled for false self syndrome, which meant that Nilsen had occasional outbreaks of schizoid disturbances that he managed most of the time to keep at bay. Such a person is most likely to disintegrate under circumstances of social isolation. In effect, Nilsen was not guilty of malice aforethought. Even the judge questioned Galloway's obtuse medical jargon, and his testimony had the effect of being over the jury's heads. A rebuttal psychiatrist was called, Dr. Paul Bowden, who had spent 14 years with Nilsen, much more than those doctors for the defense. He found no evidence for much of the testimony put forth by the other psychiatrists and thought that Nilsen was manipulative. He did see Nilsen as a unique case, with a mental abnormality but not a mental disorder. His explanation of the difference was not very clear. During the summing up, in which the case was reduced to its basic elements, the judge instructed the jury that a mind can be evil without being abnormal, thereby dispensing with all of the psychiatric jargon. The jury retired on Thursday, November 3rd. The following day, at 11:25 a.m., the judge said that he would accept a majority count, since there were 2 dissenters on every issue, except the attempted murder of Nobbs. At 4:25, they delivered a verdict, guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Dennis Andrew Nilsen to life in prison, not eligible for parole for 25 years. Nilsen was almost 38. Nilsen, no doubt, influenced many fiction writers to some degree, but one of the most sustained portrayals of a killer based on him is Poppy Z. Bright's Exquisite Corpse. In that novel, she draws together 2 serial killers, Jay Byrne, who lives in her hometown of New Orleans, and Andrew Compton from London. To Compton, murder is an art. Since he was 13, he would imagine himself dead, using makeup to enhance the effect. He uses this talent to feign his own death so he can escape from prison. Then he goes to the United States, where he meets Byrne, based in part on Jeffrey Dahmer. Together, they pick out the perfect victim. This story is filled with graphic descriptions of the dismemberments and decomposition of bodies. Bright was clearly, and admittedly, inspired by Nilsen's long and detailed account of his techniques. Her own killer, aged 33, killed 23 boys and young men between 1977 and 1988. Nilsen himself said that had he not been arrested, he would have continued what he was doing and might have left thousands of corpses. Like Nilsen, his victims were transients, and he would take care of them in such a way as to make them pliable. Also, like Nilsen, he enjoyed the act of murder, though he chose the knife. But he did not much care for the necessary dismemberment afterwards. He kept them in his flat for as long as a week, and he did not mind the odor of death. He wanted them with him so he would not feel alone. A corpse would never walk away, he says. As he cut them up, he drank alcohol, just like Nilsen, and after he was incarcerated, he filled numerous notebooks with his introspection and recollections. Although Compton is much more of a predator than Nilsen, his psychology owes its inspiration to his real-life counterpart. British authorities have thwarted Dennis Nilsen's attempt to publish his 5-volume, 4,000-page memoir, apparently called A History of a Drowning Boy, Papers from a Prisoner. Yet he's found a new means of getting some press, a letter to an editor. Incarcerated since 1983, Nilsen told police the details of his first murder, and on November 4, 2006, he sent a 3-page letter from Full Sutton Prison to an editor of the Evening Standard. While in carefully printed prose he discussed the recent development, out of consideration for the victim's family, he declined to provide the most graphic details. Numerous papers covered this event, especially London-based media such as The Times, and the letter was posted online. In it, Nilsen described his encounter with the 14-year-old boy whose death, he once had stated, had changed my life as I knew it. His name was Stephen Dean Holmes, and despite his youth, Nilsen apparently met him in the Cricklewood Arms pub. That was in 1978. While Nilsen wrote that Stephen was the first of 12 victims, the police estimate that he actually killed at least 15. He had said he'll assist in the identification of all his victims, but 7 remain unidentified. Stephen was once in this group because, at the time of Nilsen's arrest, he had not known who the boy was. He'd been on a drunken binge during their encounter and later could not find identification papers on the body. Thus, Nilsen was not charged with this murder when tried for 6 others. Yet the police had not given up. In 1990, they had taken a blurred photograph of Stephen Holmes to show Nilsen, but he'd been unable to say whether the boy pictured was the one he'd killed. Then, in January 2006, Stephen's family provided a better photo. Detectives showed it to Nilsen, and he made the identification. Stephen was his first homicide victim. Using what would become his usual MO, he'd invited Stephen back to his house for a beer. They drank together throughout the night, and Stephen stayed over. When Nilsen woke up, he panicked that Stephen would now leave him, so he used a tie to strangle him. Stephen fought but finally passed out, and Nilsen drowned him in a bucket. Faced with the difficulty of disposing of the corpse, he placed it beneath the floorboards of his flat. Over the course of 8 months, he examined it out of curiosity and finally burned the remains in the back garden until nothing was left but teeth and bone fragments. Nilsen claims that at one point he urged the police to use these items to help identify Stephen, but had learned that they'd been disposed of. The Times Online offered a few details about Stephen. Born in Hampstead to Irish parents, heterosexual and popular, he enjoyed football and rock and roll. In fact, he had disappeared on his way home from a concert. Apparently, he'd gone into the pub, possibly to warm up, before catching a bus home. Instead, he met Nilsen. Although Stephen's mother died without learning what had happened to him, his father was still alive. The minimum term of 25 years to life imprisonment, to which Nilsen was sentenced in 1983, was replaced by a whole life tariff by Home Secretary Michael Howard in December 1994. This ruling ensured he would never be released from prison, a punishment he accepted. In 2003, Nilsen was again transferred to HMP Full Sutton, where he remained incarcerated as a Category A prisoner. In the prison workshop, Nilsen translated books into Braille. He spent much of his free time reading and writing, and was allowed to paint and compose music upon a keyboard. He also exchanged letters with numerous people who sought his correspondence. Nilsen remained at HMP Full Sutton until his death on the 12th of May, 2018.